Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the August 2024 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. My name is Chris Furman. I'm the Deputy Director of NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past month. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. And joining us today, we have Laura Bellinger from the National Weather Service office in Peachtree City, Georgia, who, along with Todd, will be telling us all about the new National Water Prediction Service. So again, thank you all for joining us this morning. Just a reminder, type those questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. And a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to the recording in a day or so. All right, let's get started with an overview of the climate. Lots to go over today, so let's jump right in. So I know I usually start off with the temperature departures or with the departures from average over the past month, but in terms of temperature, nearly every location was within a degree or two of average, which is not really unusual this time of year. So the resulting map on its own wasn't really going to tell us a whole lot. So instead, what I'm showing here are the mean temperature rankings over the past month. And what they show is that those few degrees really are significant across the southern tier of the region, especially across Florida, where many locations rank as one of the top 5 warmest over the period from late July to late August. The same holds true for the U.S. Caribbean, where temperatures continue to break records or come close to breaking records across Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And now if we look across the rest of the region, the rankings don't look all that impressive, but of course that's not the whole story. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that over the past month, there was actually quite a bit of temperature variability, more than what we typically see this time of year. On the left, we're showing the highest maximum temperature recorded over the past 30 days. And we can see that much of the region saw temperatures well into the 90s, even over 100 degrees in places. That was largely back in the beginning of August. And during this time, also, a few locations in Florida recorded their all-time warmest minimum temperatures as well. And we'll actually have a complete list of those records in next week's monthly climate report. Contrast all that with the image there on the right, which shows the lowest minimum temperature recorded over the past 30 days. And what we see here, at least outside of Florida, is the effect of last week's false fall, as it's been called. That's a new term for me. I hadn't heard of that before, but it's been called a false fall, where morning lows dropped into the 50s across parts of Georgia and Alabama, and even dropped into the 40s across western and northern portions of Virginia. Maximum temperatures were also much cooler than average. Last Wednesday, the mercury only got to 78 degrees at the Raleigh-Durham Airport. That was the coolest rain-free August afternoon in over a decade. And here in Chapel Hill, the high of 75 degrees was the coolest rain-free August afternoon in 35 years. Okay, next slide. So in terms of precipitation here, we see that for many locations, it was either really wet or really dry. And Hurricane Debby had a lot to do with this, as we'll see here in a minute. And some of these precipitation anomalies are close to record breaking, not just the heavy rainfall from Debby, but the lack of precipitation across large parts of Alabama, parts of Georgia and Tennessee is also close to record breaking in some cases, with a few locations on track to record one of their top 5 driest Augusts on record. Precipitation was above average across Puerto Rico, and as with Debby, we have another tropical system, Ernesto, to thank for much of that precipitation as well. Unfortunately, we still lack a lot of precipitation data across the U.S. Virgin Islands, though some CoCoRaHS gauges have recorded over 10 inches of rain on the islands over the past month or so. Okay, next slide, please. So as we approach the end of meteorological summer, we can see that several locations across the Southeast and Caribbean are on track to record one of their warmest summers on record, with some locations across Florida on track to record their warmest summer on record, including places like Tallahassee, Daytona Beach, and Punta Gorda. San Juan, Puerto Rico, is also on track to record its warmest summer on record. As we can see, it's been a very wet summer overall across much of the Florida Peninsula and across eastern portions of the Carolinas, while the interior of the region, stretching from Alabama through much of Tennessee and into central Virginia, has been very dry. Okay, next slide. Okay, so perhaps the biggest stories over the past month were Hurricanes Debby and Ernesto, both of which significantly impacted the Southeast and the U.S. Caribbean. We'll start here with Debby. Prior to becoming a tropical cyclone, Debby actually impacted the U.S. Caribbean as a tropical disturbance around the first of the month, resulting in flash flood warnings across the western half of Puerto Rico, before crossing Hispaniola in Cuba and then entering the Gulf of Mexico, where it became a tropical storm on August the 3rd. The next day, Debbie strengthened to a Category 1 hurricane. It then turned northeast toward the Big Bend region of Florida, making landfall near Steinhatchee on the morning of August the 5th. That day, Debbie tracked across the Florida Panhandle and southeast Georgia, weakening to a tropical storm, and then moved offshore into the Atlantic the following day. From there, Debbie slowly turned back to the north, making a second landfall as a tropical storm not far from Charleston, South Carolina, in the early morning hours of August the 8th. It then became a tropical depression as it moved northward through the Carolinas and eventually into parts of the Northeast. The impacts from Debbie were far-reaching. Storm surge of over 2 feet was reported across western portions of Florida, including places that are still recovering from Hurricane Ian almost 2 years ago. Significant beach erosion was reported and numerous roads were closed in the area. Hundreds of thousands of residents across Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas lost power during the storm. Debbie also produced, at least current numbers, 21 tornadoes, including an EF3 in North Carolina that killed one person in the town of Lucama in Wilson County. That's just east of Raleigh. And this is only the third EF3 tornado recorded from a tropical cyclone in North Carolina since 1950. Debbie was also a major rainmaker, dropping over 10 inches of rain from the Big Bend region of Florida up through eastern portions of Georgia and the Carolinas, resulting in catastrophic flash flooding that inundated homes and roadways and forced numerous evacuations and water rescues. According to the South Carolina State Climatology Office, Debbie dropped over 22 inches of rain in Mock's Corner, that's located about 25 miles north of Charleston, between August 5th and 9th, which is the second highest rainfall total from a tropical cyclone in the state since 1956. It's just a couple of inches shy of the record that was set by Hurricane Florence back in 2018. And so far, there have been 10 fatalities confirmed from Debbie, and damage estimates are now around $2 billion. Okay, next slide. And so while Debbie was affecting the mainland U.S., the National Hurricane Center was watching an area in the central Atlantic for possible tropical cyclone development. On August 12th, Tropical Storm Ernesto became the fifth named tropical cyclone in the Atlantic hurricane season as it tracked through the Virgin Islands and brushed the northeast side of Puerto Rico. At one point, nearly 750,000 people were without power across the U.S. Caribbean, with nearly 24 hospitals operating on generators. Hundreds of thousands of water outages were also reported across the islands. Hurricane-force wind gusts brought down trees and power lines, which damaged homes and businesses and left many roads impassable. Interior portions of Puerto Rico recorded over 10 inches of rain, which washed away crops and flooded homes and roadways. As it tracked north, Ernesto caused dangerous surf and large waves along the east coast of the U.S., resulting in at least 3 rip current fatalities, and caused a home on the Outer Banks to collapse into the ocean, which was captured on video and shared over social media. Okay, next slide. So no surprise that the rainfall from Debbie led to major improvements in drought conditions across much of the region, especially across Georgia and the Carolinas, as well as parts of Virginia, which saw a 1-category improvement over the past few weeks. On the other hand, Alabama and Tennessee were rather dry over the past several weeks, as we saw earlier, and this will likely result in a continued expansion of drought and dryness there in the short term. Next slide. And looking in the Caribbean, we see that the region continues to be free of any drought or abnormal dryness. Okay, next slide. So it looks like we're still playing the La Niña waiting game as neutral conditions continue to prevail in the equatorial Pacific. Despite ocean temperatures in the Niño regions cooling at a slower rate than previously anticipated, though, forecasters are still expecting a transition to La Niña to occur over the next few months, with about a 75% chance of it persisting through the upcoming winter. Okay, next slide. So as we look over the next 3 months, we see that above average temperatures are favored across the southeast region, with above average precipitation favored across the eastern half of the region as well as Florida. Okay, next slide. Looking in the Caribbean, we see that above average temperatures and above average precipitation are expected through the fall. Next slide. Looking at the seasonal drought outlook, we see that some improvements are expected across northern Virginia, while drought is expected to persist across parts of southwest Virginia, Alabama, and Tennessee. And at least for now, no new development is expected across the region, and this includes the Caribbean as well. Okay, next slide. Back on August the 8th, the CPC released its mid-season hurricane outlook, and it's nearly identical to the one that was issued back in May. There's still the expectation now with a 90% probability of an above average season with 17 to 24 named storms, of which as many as 7 could become major hurricanes. So far this season, we've had 5 named storms, 3 of which have become hurricanes, with Beryl the lone major hurricane so far. Okay, next slide. Looking ahead to this weekend and early next week, above average temperatures and precipitation are likely across the region. Next slide. If we look out to 2 weeks, as we head into the first full week of September, we see a continuation of above average precipitation across the region, with below average temperatures perhaps across the interior and northern portions of the region, and above average temperatures across the southern tier. Next slide. And finally, as we look ahead to next month, we see that above average temperatures are expected across the region, with above average precipitation, except perhaps across the interior of the region. Okay, next slide should be the summary. Okay, summary. There's the summary for you to look at. Or for you to look at after the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to Todd.
Thank you, Chris. So we'll go ahead and keep on going with the next slide. And this is it. Obviously, it has been an interesting last month with all the rainfall we've had and the lack of rainfall we've had. We actually saw improvements we'll talk about Alabama and Mississippi and kind of that northern Georgia area first. As we were going through July and as we did our call last month, we did see some significant improvements because we were really dipping into drought in those areas. And but we did start to see afternoon thunderstorms, a lot of thunderstorms moving out of the north and pushing into the southeast that brought us out. So when you look at some of these 28-day average stream flows, and while you do see some below normal in there, you also see some normal and some near normal and a little bit above normal. And that's simply because during that time we did have some recovery, but the last few weeks have been really dry. As Debbie came through, and they didn't receive that rainfall, it dried out a lot of Alabama, Mississippi, and parts of those northern Georgia areas. And then, as you can see along the path of Debbie, in Florida, all the way through the coastal Georgia and a lot of the Carolinas, we did see significant improvements because we were really starting to dip into drought during that time. And so we have seen some significant improvements in those areas. So that's kind of what you see on the left-hand side with just the point data. And then just overall in the Southeast, you can see that we were with the whole Southeast as we were gotten to the end of July, we started to see some improvements last month, but we saw significant improvements when we saw Debbie come through. And so as we talk about the next few slides, and we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, one of the things you'll need to understand is that we're looking at as a whole state. So parts of these states didn't get as much of the others. And so we'll start with Alabama. And as I mentioned before, you can see where we were starting to improve. We were starting to the rivers were starting to make a recovery back into normal conditions, but the last 15 to 20 days have really had a significant impact on a lot of those rivers in the Southeast. And while I wouldn't call this a flash drought, I still think it's a little early for that. A couple of the factors that have happened is, one, we've been cooler. We've also been drier. We haven't been as humid. That beautiful weather we've seen in the last week in the Southeast has been great for being outside, but it's also kind of dried things out a little bit. And because of that and pushing all that moisture down into Florida, so we haven't had afternoon pop-up thunderstorms. We haven't seen that kind of rainfall across the Southeast. And so it has a detrimental effect over Alabama and parts of northern Georgia. However, as you look at Georgia here, you can see that we're that with all that rainfall, and especially across the parts that it did rain in, we've gone up to above normal for this time of year. And again, usually we're getting into the time of the year whether it's either feast or famine. You either get a lot of rain from tropical systems because we're in a tropical atmosphere, or we start to dry out. We had a little early fall, and that's been great. But for right now, we could still use some rain getting into the rest of fall. And so we will see where we go from there. As for Florida, We obviously, this is their rainy season, so you can see that typically we would expect them to be wet during this time of year, but with Debbie, they've been especially wet, and so now they're above normal. And we'll look at their climatology, Florida and so forth, those climatologies in a little bit with respect to flooding. But this is the time of year when they typically get flooding, and then they're above that normal. So we do see them in good shape with respect to the drought, but we have seen some significant water in the area. So let's go ahead and move on, and we'll go up the eastern seaboard, and we'll start with South Carolina. And South Carolina is almost near a record right now. The water that they saw in the last month, they're at record levels. And the storm came early enough. It seems like a lot of our storms for South Carolina and North Carolina, a lot of the big ones have come more in late September and early October. So having an Atlantic storm move up at this time of the year was at least slightly unusual, that it impacted so much of the state, and that it came up and it affected them. And you can see that in the stream flow, because they're almost near a record levels in South Carolina, going from almost the 5% level back in mid-July, all the way up to nearly above normal, and almost record level for this time of year for the 28-day average in that area. And the same goes for North Carolina. They've actually dipped. You can see that black line has gone all the way into the white, which shows that this is probably the wettest 28-day period for the state as a whole in that area. And again, they were getting into the 5% level before we had all that rainfall from Debbie, and now they have gone well above. So that's what a tropical system will do for the area, and how it can impact full states and given areas. So the last one we'll show is Virginia, and a similar thing happened, although it did stay, I think, a little bit further east and did not affect the state quite as much during that time. So we went from being very low to being above normal, but not unusually normal. And so we're starting to come back down, because we started to see some more dry weather in some of those areas. We have started to recover. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And what this is going to show is kind of, I usually show our current conditions. You can see that on the right. We have 1 point left in flood. This is Conway. This is the Waccamaw River. And it takes a long time for the water to move through that river basin. And so it has crested, and hopefully in the next 2 days, we'll fall below moderate flood stage and into minor flood stage. And then we'll only have minor flooding or less across the southeast. But on the left-hand side, you can see, and this was kind of right after the storm had moved through the southeast. And you can see all the different points that went into either from action stage all the way up to major flood stage. Now, this is just a snapshot, maybe not all of them. Some of these were forecasts, some of these, but it kind of gives you an idea of where we had impactful river stages across the southeast. And it did expand over a wide area. And then if you can look and see, just as we get west of that area, where we had very little flooding outside of there. So it was a very strong demarcation line of where we saw significant rainfall and where we didn't during Debbie. But as for now, we finally settled down a little bit. Florida is not settling down quite as much. We continue to get afternoon and evening thunderstorms. One of the things we'll have to watch very closely, especially over the next few weeks, is that they continue to get rain. They actually have a dry day today, but because they've been so wet, they are more sensitive to heavy rain, those afternoon type thunderstorms that will develop in the state. So, usually if we have a dry year or just a normal year, if they get those thunderstorms, our rivers tend not to go up very quickly. But now they're more susceptible to that right now. So we're watching those very closely. And we'll watch those over the coming month as we continue to get afternoon showers and thunderstorms, and they stay wet in that part of the area. As for the rest of the seaboard, we have dried out some in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, where we did have rain. So that's helped some. So they're not quite so sensitive now. So they can get some of that rainfall and not necessarily go up quickly. So, and that we can talk about for a sec more when we talk about the forecast. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide in the climatology. And we're in week 35 of our year. And so we're starting to get to the peak of hurricane season, our second peak for flooding across the Southeast. And again, that has a lot to do with the tropical season. And as I say every month, just because I think it's important to note, is that we can get flooding during any week of the year. So we always have to pay attention to that. But we're in week 35, and so now we're getting to the peak of the hurricane season, and that September into mid-October timeframe when we are a lot more active. And when we do get rainfall, we do tend to see flooding during those times. So this is our, hopefully when we talk next month, hopefully we won't have to talk about a bunch of flooding during that time. Hopefully we'll talk about just a little bit of rainfall that has improved conditions across the area, and so forth. And then we'll have our next thing we'll have to be talking about La Niña, and we'll be talking about that over the next couple of months as we start to look to the winter season for potential drought. So let's go ahead and go to the next climatology slide, which shows Florida. So we're in week 35, and while there is flooding in Florida, and much of it had to do with Debbie, this is not unusual. This is the time of year when we would expect to have flooding in that area. This is the peak we're getting in the next 4 to 6 weeks. That's our peak for flooding in Florida. And then it kind of abruptly cuts off when we get to November, as we get out of tropical season, as we started to transition from tropical season to their dry season. But for the next 5 to 6 weeks, again, we'll have to watch that very closely. And they're especially susceptible now because they continue to stay wet and get rainfall in the area. So they need a bit of a break right now. Hopefully they can get a bit of a break. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. And this is just the outlook. And I know that we've been dry over in Alabama and parts of northern Florida or northern Georgia and Mississippi. And that I know we've been dry, but we still have the potential for an active tropical season. And so we can't rule out, because all it will take is one storm to move up into that area to now, and we've had enough rain earlier in the summer that I still think we have, a normal risk for that area. We've kind of been going back and forth, but we do have a higher risk as we look in Florida and along the, and we look along the seaboard, and, all the way up the coast. So it's just something we're going to have to watch very closely over the next month or so as we see what happens with hurricane season. I just read kind of on Chris, talking about the hurricane season. We've had a very active Pacific hurricane season this year, which is very unusual as you transition or in a La Nina year that wasn't expected. One of the reasons they say that maybe we're not getting as much development out in the Atlantic is there's cooler waters off of Africa and the development zone, and that it's keeping things from really developing out there. But all the conditions are still in place for the potential for having some storms coming up over the next month and a half. So we can't let our guard down, and we have to be prepared for that. So let's go to our last slide, which I think is my overview slide. And with that, you can read this later, and I will pass it off to Pam.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. Let's jump right in so we give Laura plenty of time to talk. Agriculture, of course, is in high activity right now. Some of the recent conditions on agriculture, areas with more rain were experiencing expansion of pests and diseases, and farmers were having difficulty getting into the fields even before Debbie hit parts of the region. Some areas were pretty dry, as Chris mentioned, and they were using really heavy irrigation if they had it to combat the dryness and water stress. And so that, of course, is a cost because they have to pump it, and that usually costs diesel unless you have a solar pump. Hurricane Tropical Storm Debbie dumped up to 20 inches of rain locally in some places, drowned a lot of crops, wind shredded tobacco, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Debbie in just a minute. So there's a lot of different things going on. They're still counting the cost for that. And then surprisingly, a week after Debbie came through, the wet parts of the state were having to irrigate again because it's a very sandy soil and a lot of it didn't sink in. when it rains that hard, most of it just runs off into the rivers. And so the farmers are back to irrigating already, even in areas where they got a lot of rainfall. And that's one of the places where average statistics over a long time doesn't really help, because if you get dry spell, flood, dry spell, then the average can be pretty close to normal, but it doesn't really capture the whole picture, especially for plants, because agriculture, they got to have water frequently, and so that's something to keep in mind. A couple of pictures here on the left. One of them shows the erosion in a peanut field in Screven County, which is just northwest of Savannah. That's one of the places that we had some unofficial reports of 20 inches. You can see the erosion there in the field. And then on the bottom, fall armyworm damage. This is from the South Carolina Grower newsletter. Usually armyworms are mostly hurting forage crops, but this year they're so bad because the climate has been very, you know, good for them, that they're attacking lawns. This is a picture of a lawn that's been hit by fall armyworms. So let's go on. Just looking at the soil temperature and moisture. Soil temperature right now is really pretty close to the long-term average. Few areas in Florida above, few areas in North Carolina and Virginia below, but not anything close to what we're seeing out to the west, where it's been very, very dry, and very, very hot because it's been dry. Soil moisture on the right there shows that we are having some surface drying from the last week. And that's consistent with having these warmer temperatures. And really, I'm not even getting clouds outside today. It's the humidity is down so much. And so that has really led to, I think, the expansion of some abnormally dry conditions in Alabama. If we go on, growing degree days, temperatures have been pretty close to normal, as Chris mentioned, and so growing degree days are pretty much keeping on track with the average, depending on where you are, a little bit above or a little bit behind. Also, obviously, it depends on exactly when you planted. You can track this on the agroclimate tools. The link is down there. You can use that later. So if we go on, I've got several slides here on Debbie, just because it's consumed a lot of my time the last few weeks. Rainfall amounts, definitely there's a large area of more than a foot of rainfall. I think the largest I got at one of my UGA weather stations was about 13 or 14 inches. That's in about a day and a half. And so you can imagine what that was like. You can see drowned fields there. There's a drowned cotton field on the top left. And then there's the picture of the peanut field with all the erosion. And one of the other things that really got hit was tobacco, which is a high value crop. It's a specialty crop that grows in Georgia and other parts of the Southeast. And timing is everything with these storms. The tobacco was just about ready to be harvested. And so it really took a huge hit. In Georgia, we estimate that probably 50 to 75% of the crop was lost because of the damage, the combined damage of the winds just shredding those leaves on the plants, and some of the water. The wind whipped crops also are still being evaluated. Sometimes it takes a while to know how much yield loss you're going to get from the crops. There's some recovery that happens in some crops, and of course, crops like peanuts and cotton still have a while to grow, and so they may grow out of some of the worst damage. It's hard to tell that, but definitely their wind has blown a lot of the cotton bolls off the plants in some areas, and there are stem injuries from all the whipping of the gusty winds. With the water on the ground, there was quite a few losses to melons and other crops that sit on the ground, because once it gets hit by flood water, you cannot legally sell it because of contamination in the flood water. And so that's something that has really caused problems for some vegetable growers. So let's go on. All right, here's some more pictures. You can see there's watermelons on the ground. Some of those will probably have to be just trashed. I know farmers were working like crazy to try to harvest all this before Debbie came through. The initial losses from Debbie to Georgia agriculture were estimated at over 3 million. I suspect that will go up over time. That included a lot of loss of power, damage to poultry coops in low-lying areas. I think I heard an estimate of, a couple million chickens were drowned. Oh, here it is. Irwin County alone lost 54,000 chickens. They put them in flat areas, and sometimes those are areas that are prone to getting flooded. There were power outages to dairies, a lot of damage to roads, so it was hard to get trucks in to take care of the milk, and damage to pecans, vegetables, and other corn. Corn was one of the first things that gets harvested here in Georgia, and so that was really hurt more than some of the other crops were. Pecan farmers said they lost 10 to 15% of their yield from nuts that are blowing off of the trees, but it was better than they expected. If you look at Idalia last year and Michael in 2018, there were definitely worse losses there. Flooded fields are causing a lot of problems, oxygen deprivation of the roots. Plants are very stressed. You can see how yellow the field there is on the right-hand side. One of the things that does is it causes the roots stop taking up nutrients and it starts rotting, which puts out ethylene gas, and that increases ripening, and so the farmers have less time to harvest their crops, and the quality can certainly also vary with that. So if we go on, one of the things I've been spending my time at is crop insurance. To get crop insurance, you have to have a combination, for at least for the way most of the policies are written, you have to have a combination of greater than 6 inches of rain, and you have to have sustained winds of 39 miles per hour or greater. And in Debbie, the winds died off pretty fast, and so it was hard to find that. Also, because the network of rain gauges is pretty sparse down in the southern part of the state, I think some of the numbers are probably too low, and I've been working with people to try to find extra data for that. Some of those counties that are not included in the accepted zone for insurance certainly had a lot of damage, and we're trying to work on that to see if we can get that area expanded. Sometimes RMA will do that. So insurance is tricky. I mean, they really set high levels, and it's very hard to get those both those levels at the same time. And so you have to be really careful when you buy insurance of whether or not you think you're likely to beat that level. We go on. I just did want to mention that there is the potential, at least, for the development of flash drought, mostly in Alabama. That's where it's already been pretty dry. That, of course, they got missed by Debbie. And so with the continued hot and very dry conditions we're having now, there's a potential for that. I think after next week, there's going to be a little change in the pattern as we're going to go into something more wet. So that may or may not last, but we'll just have to see. That's something that I think farmers are really watching carefully, because we need that water yet. A lot of the crops are growing like crazy. We need to fill out the pods for peanuts and for soybeans, and the cotton still has a way to go as well. So we're really watching that carefully. If we go on, here's my summary, and I will let you look at that later. Sorry, I didn't get any agricultural information for Ernesto, but that is something I'll try to get for next time. And we're just starting to now watch the tropics again, because there's a potential for a storm named Francine to develop. Not a very high chance right now, but it's after having a really dead period. It'll be interesting to see how these waves start to develop over time again. We have a long way to go to get through the alphabet. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Laura Bellinger, and I'm looking forward to her. She's going to introduce herself, and she's going to drive her own slides.
Okay, let me make sure that I'm sharing my screen here. Okay.
Laura, it looks perfect.
So, great, thank you, Meredith. So my name is Laura Belanger. I'm the Senior Service Hydrologist out of NWS Atlanta, and it's my privilege today to bring you kind of an interactive debrief, I suppose you could call it, on the new National Water Production Service. I've been at the Atlanta office as the Senior Service Hydrologist for approximately the last 6 years. The last 2 of those, I've actually had the privilege of being on the NWIPS team, as we call it. So while the website did kind of experimentally, officially, depending on who you ask, roll out back in March, we officially turned it over the summer. And so when you navigate to water.noaa.gov, this is now what you're greeted with right off the bat. So this is your default view. So for those of you who were familiar with AHAPS, this is a little different. We'd like to think that the user experience is a lot more improved. The National Water Prediction Service page does serve as the new hub for water data, products, services. We're combining everything from the local and regional water data and forecasts with new capabilities. So we'll talk about the flood inundation mapping, the national water model, that sort of thing. So this is really leveraging a more modern infrastructure, the geospatial technology, cloud computing, that sort of thing, to improve that user experience. And the idea is that this can be used before, during, and after flood events. Now, like with AHAPs, when we talk about this, you'll see that some of the things are a little different, but are calling back towards what we had on AHAPs. So things like the hydrographs and forecasts are readily available, the precipitation estimates, the long-range outlooks, all of those things are still here. It just maybe looks a little different in how you access it. There are some new key features that have been integrated into NWIPS to enhance that user experience. So things like this dynamic national map we're about to talk about, a lot more expansive layers, flexible options. We've got the improved dynamic hydrographs, but also those static images that you're looking for as well. And then also the National Water Model Guidance Forecasts, the phased rollout of real-time comprehensive flood inundation mapping, and also API services. So we hope that kind of you're along for the ride. Feel free to pull up your own window here and work through this as we go through. But then also I've provided Meredith with some links. So as this gets posted later, those will be available to you. So like I said, when you open up the National Water Prediction Service page or NWIPS page, you're greeted with this national map. You'll very quickly see that there's a banner across the top that says that there's a quick start guide available and other resources. That's going to stay there for a little while. And so the intent there is to allow you to see facts pages, again, the quick start guide, recordings, all of that is available as you get more and more comfortable with this new website. Now, I will point out to you, if you can see my cursor, I don't know if you can, but in the top left, that National Water Prediction Service area there, if you were to just get lost at some point and want to come back home to this view, you would simply just click this one. Now, this map, like we mentioned, is kind of a layered, flexible option, something that you can really customize for yourself. So this does allow you to zoom in and out over to an area. So I'll zoom in to the southeast, and so I'll let the screen catch up here for a minute. You'll also notice on the right, there's this menu here that pops up. You have the option of choosing your map view. So for example, if you would prefer to see what the satellite picture looks like, you can very quickly use the drop-down menu and change that perspective. We've done our best to change the coloring here as well so that these icons will still stand out to you. I personally still like that topographic map, so I'm going to go back to it. Now in that next section here, what you'll see are the layers. And this is all the river gauge information. So what the default includes is a subset of the observations and forecasts. So you'll see the color coding likens back to that AHAPS data. As you mouse over these points, they do provide some additional information. You can see those gray text boxes popping up to provide some guidance to you. You do have the ability to go down here. And so let's say, for example, I'm not interested in cluttering the map with locations where the data is not current or is out of service. I can click these off. You'll see some slight changes there on the map. But let's say you only want to look at observations and none of the forecasts. You can also utilize these top kind of column headers here, observation and forecast. You could click these on all the way or click it again to turn them all the way off. And so what you're seeing here is just the observational data. Again, if you want to go back to what you had before, just go up to that top left National Water Prediction Service logo and click on that and kind of resets things. Now, if you notice, as we go through this, the URL at the top of the screen is constantly being updated as you customize things. So this means that you do have the ability to copy and paste that URL. And so if you needed to share what your view is, to somebody else, so they're looking at the exact same thing, it is using sort of that save static URL for you to be able to compare apples to apples as you're looking at things. Now, one of the other really great things about this display, and I'm going to turn these forecasts back on here. One of the other great things about this new site is this search bar. So you have the ability to look at, if you want to look at the Chattahoochee, for example, the Chattahoochee is in my area. If I spell it correctly, it'll come up here and you'll see kind of the top hits there for the Chattahoochee, or you can actually click on see all search results and see the extensive comprehensive list of anything that has Chattahoochee in it. You also have the ability to search by the Weather Forecast Office or by the state. So I'm going to quickly do that here and type in Georgia. And if I click on that, you'll see that the map jumps to Georgia and actually provides a colored outline to say that this is where we're focusing. Now, if you go back to that right-hand column menu, underneath all the observation and forecast columns, it says limit by boundary. So you'll notice the little numbers by all those check boxes is keeping a running tally of all of those kind of categories or labels there for whatever view you're using. But if you're specifically just interested in an area, like in this case, the state of Georgia, I can click limit by boundary. And what that does is then adjust the tallies there under observation and forecast to just be for the state of Georgia. I can do this also for my weather forecast office. We are Foxtrot, Charlie, and so we can adjust that as well. The other thing that you can do here is click on only display partner FIM gauges. Now, we'll talk in a minute about the real-time flood inundation mapping in that phased rollout that's occurring, but right now, these are the partner FIM locations that are available in this area. And I'll click that back off. Okay, and before we get into sort of the deeper detailed look at what the gauge pages actually look like, I did want to call attention to other things that you have the ability to customize. You can turn on hazards. If I zoom back out here, I'll click all the way back to the home page so we see the national view. If we go down on the right side to hazards, you not only have the option to see the hydrologic hazards, which that is by default turned on. You can see over there in New Mexico, there's some flood watches in place, and you can click on these and have that map adjust so that column on the right, that display window, it actually extends out to provide the text product for this flood watch. So you can see here that this is issued by the NWS Albuquerque office, and I can quickly close that. Now you also have the option to just say, hey, I want to see all the hazards. Now, again, this is a work in progress because this is a mostly hydro-focused page coming from the Weather Service. And so we continue to provide updates to this site to be able to, again, enhance and improve that user experience. So if you happen to notice that maybe one of these other weather-related hazards might be a little off, it's probably because we're working on it. But you'll notice here there's some excessive heat warnings out in the Midwest. You've got some heat advisories that are out here as well. And so this does allow you to see all of the hazards should you be interested in those. I'm going to turn it back to just the hydrologic hazards. Okay, before we go on to precipitation estimates and the water model, I do want to show you what the gauge pages look like. Now, I've done a little bit of background research here to try and provide you some of the better options for information that can be displayed today, given there's not a whole lot of active weather out there. And so what we're going to do for this is to go up to our search bar. We're actually going to South Carolina to a gauge that is CMDS1. Okay, and this is the Watery River near Camden, South Carolina. And I clicked this one just because, or I chose this one because it is a little interesting as far as the hydrograph goes. So you'll notice that when I search for this, it very quickly jumps to the zoomed in location. And you can see that the inner circle is telling me what the observation is, which is currently no flooding. And also the outer circle tells me that this is a forecast point and the current forecast is also no flooding. And if I go to click on this, we have sort of a previewed gauge page that shows that very quickly off on the side. It's intended to be sort of a one-stop shop to show you the most important information. And so you'll notice here that there's a mouse over option for the hydrograph that not only tells you the time in that gray box on the bottom, but the observation in both stage height and flow should it be appropriate for that site. And so this is a big improvement on over AHAPS, where this did not allow you to kind of pull the data as it was coming in. And then on the right, beyond this blue dotted vertical line that shows us the current time, you can see what the forecast is. Same thing, you can mouse over to get that data. Now there's some other ways that we can customize this, and I'll show you that in a minute, but I do want to show you that this really is intended to be a very quick view for this river gauge, and allows you to even go to some of these links. Like, for example, if I was to click on SERFC here, it would take me to their view of NWIPS. Same with state or the Columbia office here. And then also I could go directly to the USGS page here. I think that's for the Southeast Water Resource area and not for this gauge specifically. That would be housed on the actual gauge page. Now, one of the most frequent questions that we get is, this is great, but this does not allow me to send an image to a partner or a user or allow collaboration in the sharing of data more than just a URL. And so you can find that information here. We call this a hamburger menu, which that was new terminology for me, so hopefully you understand that. So this hamburger menu here allows you a couple of different options, like printing or how you view it, but then you can also download the image, either a PNG, JPEG, etc., and that does allow you to save that, what we call a static hydrograph. So for example, if I want to view it now, it pops up in a second window. And so this is customarily what you would be seeing provided by AHAPS. This is just through NWIPS. So I'll close out this window as we move forward into the full information. And I guess before I do that, I will call attention, there are these hotkeys here for upstream gauge and downstream gauge. Because this is a coastal location, there's no downstream reach that's available for this, but it does allow us for very quick navigation if we wanted to continue upstream. Okay, now what we'll do is we'll click on full information. And immediately what pops up is just a very sort of expanded view of what we were already looking at. You'll notice some tabs at the top here. It says official forecast and national water model guidance. And so we're going to talk quickly about the official forecast first. You'll also notice that this was the last updated observation here right underneath the river name. Now, as we go down here, one of the best parts about these static hydrographs is that you'll notice that there's more of a time window that allows you to pan backwards. So one of the reasons why I picked this gauge specifically was because that this gauge saw high water as a result of Debbie. So you'll notice here that it actually climbed up to 30.30 feet here. And so we can actually see that that happened on Saturday, August 10th, kind of a few days after that heavy rainfall. And then again, we can kind of watch that river level drop beyond that point. Now, if we were to just, call attention maybe to the last 1 day or so, what we're seeing here is that in the last 24 hours, the data has been pretty straight lined here, and we may not be able to see all the flood categories. So this may not be the best example, but it would allow you on another site to be able to scale to flood categories here. And you see a little bit of an adjustment where within the full view now of that hydrograph, we have that blue dotted line to indicate record, which here is 40.4 feet. And then we're also seeing that full major, moderate, minor categories and then action stage as well. You also have some hot buttons down here to turn off the observed value, for example, or maybe the official forecast, which does allow you, again, to customize what you're seeing. There's also reminders here on what your flood categories are, something you're probably very familiar with. We'll extend this back out for a second. And then as we go down, again, these are things that were already inherent to AHAPS. You can see that we've got our flood impacts. If you want to see more of those, you can click the show more, show less option. And then you've got your gauge info here. If I was to click directly on the USGS serial number here, it would take me directly to the corresponding USGS site, which is a great kind of quick feature that we have. And then just like we had with AHAPs, we have the recent crests and historic crests here. You'll notice that 30.30 feet, the service hydrologist there, it might have been Leonard, it may have been somebody else, has already been able to put the Debbie crest in here. So you'll see that what we were seeing up previously on that dynamic hydrograph is already listed here on recent crests. So great job, Leonard. You'll also see references down here to the vertical datums. If gauge photos are available, you'll see these listed here, and he actually has quite a few of what the upstream, downstream, and gauge photos look like for this location. So that's really great. This is a lot more user-friendly view compared to what we had before. So expect your local service hydrologists to start adding these photos here in the near future. And then there's more probability information and things like that available down here. I did want to call attention before we move away from this site to this link here called Area Hydrographs. And so that allows you to see all of the hydrographs for this particular weather forecast office. So if you were accustomed to having sort of a bulk view of activity over the area, this is where you would find that now, where it's saving those static hydrographs, and you can actually scroll down through these and see that information. Now, I very quickly want to go back and talk about for a moment the National Water Model Guidance. And so I'm going to very quickly scroll up here to the very top, and where you'll see where we had official forecast here and then National Water Model Guidance. I want to click on that, and you're very abruptly presented with this kind of banner that pops up to remind you that this is not a human forecast. It is water model guidance. It's done by a computer, and so to use it with a grain of salt as guidance for decisions. So you'll notice here that there's a couple of different graphs that you're seeing, hydrographs. So in this case, this is a stream flow prediction based on the short range and then the analysis of what's currently occurring. You'll notice in this case, the default is for the observations and the official forecast done by the RFC to be turned off. And that is to make sure that there's no confusion about which is an observation and then what is a human produced forecast. And so this can be turned back on. And then there's also some other options here on what the medium guidance, the medium range guidance is. You can click those on. And so right now, again, as everyone has previously mentioned, not much rainfall in the forecast. And so in this case, as you look at this location and then areas downstream as you get closer to the coast, we're not expecting much in the way of downstream rises. Okay. Now let's go back to the very beginning, and we'll do that again by clicking this link at the top to go to our home default screen. Now, again, one of the big comments that we have is, well, it's really great to see this precipitation estimate, but how do I do that in a way that doesn't have all these icons cluttering it? So you can turn on your precipitation estimates here by going down this customizable window and then clicking on precipitation estimate. But again, you've got all those river gauges there. So my recommendation is to use this other option, which under more water information, a little plug, shameless plug here, if you're interested in things like API or links to our drought information, or there's also a link to drought.gov. That would also be found here under more water information. But we're going to stop at the first one, and that is precipitation estimate. And by clicking on this one, it goes ahead. It basically, when it loads, it is removing those things for you so that you don't have to worry about clicking those things off. So you'll see that the data for today is slowly coming in. The West Coast is still coming in for today. I do want to show you by clicking the enabled button here and then going back to day. This should look very similar to what we had on AHAPs. We're going to back up all the way to August 7th and see the data that came in for one of the days that Debbie was continuing to torment the Southeast. So you'll see that this this loads rather quickly here. Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay. And if I zoom in, one of the other options here is display estimated precipitation on hover. So this is different from AHAPS, where it does actually provide you an average for that little square, that density area for the rainfall. So in this case, it's estimating that maybe in this area here, got about on average 8.02 inches. We found emergency managers have really enjoyed having this estimate provided to them on that map scale. In addition to other things like your departure from normal, percent of normal, and normal values, which also allow you to have that hovered approach, okay? The last thing, because I know we're coming up right at 11 o'clock, I do want to talk to you about the flood inundation mapping. Okay, so if I turn off our precipitation estimates and instead do flood inundation, this is a new service that's being provided by, again, the National Water Center. And I will show you this map here. So you'll notice that the green shaded areas on the US map, that's the FIM 10 area. So it's the 10% population that rolled out in October 2023. Exciting news, if you didn't already know about it, the 30% area is rolling out this October. So anything that's colored in blue is going to have these FIM available services this coming October. And I'm excited to say that our area is included in the FIM 60, which will roll out in October 2025. So what's available right now, given it's not October yet, is a small area for flood inundation mapping. And so if I go, let me see here. Okay, if we go back here and I'm going to turn on our observations and forecasts and then scroll back down to flood inundation, you'll notice that there's a couple of options here for your guidance options. An RFC max forecast means that it's taking the forecast provided by the river forecast centers and allowing that to go downstream and highlight a stream reach based on the colored category you're expecting. So in this case, these 2 points here in South Carolina are expected to be an action stage in that forecast period. And so it's color coded that stream reach as action stage. Likewise, for the area here, it's forecasting moderate flooding. So it has color coded that stream reach for moderate flooding. If we were looking at one of that 10% FIM area, what would show here is not just a max forecast when you use some of these other drop-down options like latest analysis or maybe the water model max forecast. What it would provide for you is an anomaly here. And then we also will be providing that kind of wet, not wet extent information. And so unfortunately, we don't have the ability to see that today, given the lack of flooding in that 10% area, but I would encourage you to be looking at this as we move forward into October and then into next year for the Southeast area and how you're utilizing that for decisions. We just saw a presentation about a week ago about an office that was able to advise a nursing home not to evacuate based on inundation information. So that was kind of exciting to see how that was used kind of in a real-time sense. So I know this was a very quick walk. I hope you learned something today, and I will turn it back to Meredith.
Thank you so much, Laura. There was a lot going on this month. We recognize that, and I think all the presenters did an extremely good job of covering it, feast and famine, as well as, of course, the excellent overview and demo of this new incredibly powerful tool. So we're really grateful for that. We are at time. We have a couple of questions. Maybe we can get to them. Laura, can you stay on for a minute?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. For those of you who can join us, that would be fantastic. I also just want to remind folks our next webinar is going to talk about a new expanded tool for the Southeast related to fire weather. We're approaching the fall fire season, so please tune in for that, as well as an ENSO outlook after that. And so our first question for you will be related to the precipitation estimate maps. Could you remind us again on what stations and networks are utilized to create those maps?
Yeah, and this is actually maybe a good question for Todd to kind of chime in here. So the precipitation estimates that are provided on this page are those that are quality controlled by way of the RFC. So it's a multi-stage, multi-sensor kind of combination of data that's being kind of blessed and then pushed out to the NWIPS page. And so it's a combination of things like MRMS, co-op data, COCO RAWs, a whole bunch of networks that get pulled into their system to provide the ground truth for those multi-radar, multi-sensor estimates. Todd,
And
did
yes,
I get that
Meredith,
correctly?
this is done at each of the RFCs across the country, and so each RFC has people that are looking at this data and quality controlling it.
That's great, thank you. I'm looking at some of the other questions. I think I'm going to take those offline, but especially because we're already over time, just want to again thank you all for joining this webinar series co-hosted by the National Weather Service, the Southeast Regional Climate Center, and NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System program. We are going to send out a webinar recap. You can also access and share it online from drought.gov, the US Drought Portal. And if you have a moment after the webinar to tell us how we can improve this webinar, we're always grateful for your input. With that, thank you so much to all of our speakers today, and we hope to see all of you next month. Take care.